Good morning, everybody. And first order of business, let's start with some introductions. I'm Jen March from CCC. I'm the IBO board chair. I'll turn it over to Louisa.
Hi, I'm Louisa Chafee. I'm the director of the IBO.
Brim Hudson, I am a member of the IBO board.
Hi, Paquita Davis Friday, the interim dean of the Zipman School of Business at Berlin College.
Dean Fullahan, currently at the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governments.
No Hartzog, New York Family. It's like a party.
Wayne Ho, Chinese American Planning Council.
Mark Page, IBO board.
Jackie Sherman, IBO General Counsel.
Tom Leader, IBO lead data manager.
Sarita Romanian, assistant director for education at IBO.
Lisa Mary, first deputy at IBO.
Jacob Berman, assistant director of social and community services here at IBO.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Stefanski. I'm an assistant director for housing, environment, and infrastructure.
Good morning, I'm Michael Tager, assistant director for economics and taxes at IBO.
Francesco Brini, executive deputy city control. Hi, I'm Eric Roger. I'm a lead economist at IBO. Joyce Price, community development at IBO.
Only for the second, I'm Duncan.
Tony Petty, environmental president, probably handle.
Are the others here or question time? Sonia Guarda, senior education analyst.
Great, and can we go through, Mary, would you like to start on the screen?
I'm Mary Uktam. I'm from City University of New York, Brooklyn College Undergraduate Center, and I was the former chair of the PhD program.
Great. And we also have Henry Garrido.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Henry Garrido. I'm the Executive Director of District Council 37. So good to see so many friends and acquaintances, and appreciate the opportunity to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Dan Master.
Good morning, everyone. Dan Master, Counsel to Staten Island Borough President Vito Fossella.
And Elizabeth Guzman.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Guzman, General Counsel to Public Advocate Jamani Williams.
Morning.
Morning.
Robert Miraglia.
Good morning, everyone. Robert Miraglia here for Bronx Borough President. I'm the General Counsel. Happy to be here with everyone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy Slattery. I am the Budget Director for Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine. Hello.
Good morning. And then I think that we have IBO staff. Do you want to start, Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Kane. I'm the Budget Review and Labor Analyst.
I'm so sorry. I just missed Krista Olson with the Controller's Office. Krista.
Hi, I'm Krista Olson, Deputy Controller for Budget with the Office of the Controller.
Good.
Thank you.
And Emily. Emily has no audio and she says good morning. Rochelle.
Rochelle Rainoff, Communications Advisor, IBO.
Great, I think that's everyone, and Tara's over there now. Tara.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to be off camera, but my laptop will be recording. Tara Swanson, I'm the Senior Production Coordinator here at IBO. Just yell if you need me to do anything. I have headphones.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Oh, Alan Swisher. Sorry, Alan Swisher.
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm here from the Queensborough President's Office.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Stephanie, I could see people popping in. Great. Okay.
Great, so I think the first order of business is I need a motion and then a second to approve the minutes of the March 14th, 2023 board meeting.
I'll move. Second.
Mark second, all in favor?
Aye.
Great. So one exciting agenda item today involves the consideration and recommendation of 5 candidates for appointment to the IBO Advisory Board. The New York City Charter specifies, as you know, the size of the advisory board is 10 individuals. It sets forth qualifications for each seat on the advisory board. Currently, before we vote on new members, we only have 5 members serving. Advisory members are appointed to 5-year staggered terms by the controller, the public advocate working together. The controller and public advocate act based on recommendations made by the remaining members of the advisory board. And I'm just going to briefly review the candidates and the specific role for which they are to be recommended. Melanie Hartzar is to be recommended to serve in the role of the nationally recognized expert in the field of budget theory and budget process for a term ending March 31st, 2025. Dean Houlihan is to be recommended to serve in the role of a former director of the New York State Division of Budget or of a comparable legislative or executive office in another state government for a term ending March 31st, 2025. Derek Hamilton, who's not here today, but will join us in future meetings, is to be recommended to serve in the role of a dean or director or former dean or director of a graduate school of public administration or public affairs or public policy located in New York City for a term ending March 31st, 2026. Lakita Davis Friday is with us this morning, is to be recommended to serve in the role of a dean or director or former dean or director of a graduate school of business administration located in New York City for a term ending on March 31st, 2027. And Henry Garrido, who's joined us via Zoom, is to be recommended to serve in the role of an officer or former officer of or economic advisor of a labor union for a term ending March 31st, 2028. There's brief biographical information on each candidate appointee in the materials today. And before we move to the resolution, I just wondered if anyone has any questions for the potential appointees.
How much work do we give them before
So I want you all to refer to the resolution in your packet. The advisory board is now prepared to make recommendations to the controller and public advocate. With a member, I need a move to adopt the proposed resolution. So
I'll second.
Seconds. Comments, questions? Okay, all in favor, can we move to vote on the resolution? Aye. Welcome. Really excited. Thank you. Okay. So the next step is we expect the appointments to be formalized by the public advocate. Thank you. Lisa.
Thank you. Well, I can't say how excited I am to have 10 advisory board members present. So thank you. Would like to thank the controller and the public advocate in advance of their rapid approval. And I'd also like to thank Jackie Sherman for pushing this whole process through. Thank you. So it's very exciting. I was going to do a few updates on what's been going on at the IBO in the last couple of months. As you know, I started as the director of the IBO March 1. And so since then, we've done one mandated report, our executive budget report, which we submitted on the 15th, and the associated testimony, which I will admit was not as well attended as some of the other testimony that day, but that was fine by us, given the nature of the excitement earlier in the day. We've also had a whole series of reports. Actually, I'll start with I have to put my reading glasses on, sorry. I'm going to start with the executive. So we are cautiously optimistic on the budget. IBO in their repricing found approximately a $2.1 billion surplus, which if carried over to next year will lead to a balanced budget. In the out years, we found increasing shortfalls from 5.8 to 7.7 billion, depending, and a large spread between expenditures and revenues. So really highlighting the need for state and federal monies to remain steady. In the area of risks, we flagged a number of areas of risks. The end of the COVID money, we all knew it was coming, but it is certainly will be a challenge for the city. The asylum seeker arrivals, and we did a report on it, and the people who did that are going to speak in detail about that, because we think we should understand our methodology, the point in time findings and where we're going. We flagged as a potential risk the union settlements, not the actual existence of the union settlements, but rather that OMB had set, or that the mayoralty had set aside relatively low amounts of money for the union settlements, as not an unstandard procedure, but given the number that needed to be finalized, certainly an additional fiscal cost to the city. Vacancies are both a plus and a minus. As we all know, the level of vacancy, the unstrategic planning in the vacancies has caused major operational issues as flagged in the mayor's management report, etc. And at the same time, vacancies allow fiscal savings. And so it presents a challenge. And within agencies, we're particularly concerned about risks in NYCHA, about the city's obligation or the escalation of city obligation to the MTA, and about some of the Department of Education, upcoming Department of Education costs. And Sarita and Partee are going to speak a little bit about legislation and classroom size and our yet to be published, but soon to be public findings in that area. And in addition to these reports, we've published a whole series of other reports. We've also embarked on a strategic planning process. Many of us are masked today because we have a full day retreat tomorrow. It's a pretty exciting process for IBO to really go back and think about its mission and vision and values and how those are executed. When I was brought on, my intention was to build upon the excellence of IBO. But some of that is also thinking about how in 2023 do we communicate? How do we, what do we publish and when and how? How do we remain relevant and, fulfill our charter mandated obligations and at the same time provide relevant policy information to a broad swath of New York City stakeholders? So strategic planning. I would like you all to look at the website as it is soon going away. We are in the process. We have a consultant on board. We are in the final sprint to finalize the design. We're working with the city's Department of Technology for the build, and within months we expect to have a new website which will allow you to find things which we're very excited about, including your own bio. We're going to move. This lovely location is completely full. If you walk around, we are literally hampered to hire because we are at such high occupancy. So the administration prior to mine did an amazing job and found spectacular space. And we are grateful to DCAS in their rapid movement to get us to move by April 1 of 2024. And lastly, we have some staff comings and goings. So we have said goodbye to some fantastic members of the staff, and congratulations to Controller for hiring many of them.
Out of here.
We're proud of we've had some staffing changes within the agency. So Lisa Neary is first deputy and Indira is the chief administrative officer. We've had some other movements in the staff, and as is expected, analysts arrive and analysts leave. So we thank everyone for their service, and we're super excited about our growing alumni network, which we're going to activate much more to help bring in different opinions and thoughts that also help get the word about IBO out to a broader group. So that's in brief my updates. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to take that as success. And we're going to talk about recent publications. So I think the first are Sarah and Jacob are going to talk about the report that we produced, a one-page report that we produced prior to the general welfare hearing on asylum seekers based on questions that City Council Finance had presented in advance.
It's actually a good question. About how many folks do we have at IBO now? Is that how much larger people can grow?
37 about, uh, a couple more. I mean, you know, there's always, look, the city is in tight financial times. We want to do our part. We're genuinely down. We have room in our budget. We also need to you know, we have a charter mandate to operate at a certain level. But we need to be smart and stupid. So a couple more.
Sorry.
No, please.
All right, so.
But you guys should come up to the table because the acoustics from back there are impossible.
I mean, I lean forward here.
No, go to the table.
There'll be temporary seats and then we'll leave for the next people.
Don't be intimidated because Dean's dressed so nicely.
Left my suit jacket at home. All right, good morning, everyone. So, like I said before, I'm Jacob Berman, one of the assistant directors here. Before I start, I just want to shout out the analyst who's unfortunately not here, who actually did a lot of this analysis, Claire Salant. So, yeah, we thank Claire for actually doing the work that Sarah and I are going to talk about. So, why did we want to look at asylum seekers? So, as a lot of people are aware, the mayor has had quite a bit of rhetoric about the high costs of asylum seekers. There's a $4.3 billion number that has been floating around a lot. And so we set out to answer how realistic do we think that would be? And the 4.3 billion was for this year and next fiscal year, which is really what we focused our analysis on. And the other main piece here is that the high cost of asylum seekers has been tied to the pay cuts. And there really weren't any counter estimates out there. And so we took it upon ourselves to build off of previous IBO work on estimating shelter costs and applied them to asylum seekers.
All right, so really high level on what we did, and if people want to discuss details or just more information questions, we're happy to answer that. But our cost estimate had three components to the calculation. So the first thing we looked at was the number of asylum seekers in the city's care. So there are people arriving to the city, not all of them stick around, and not all of them are entering shelters. So we wanted to know and the largest cost of asylum seekers to the city, 80% of that cost is the cost of shelters. So that's sort of where we first looked at. And we got data broken out by the type of household composition. So are these families with small children? Are these individuals? Again, because those have different cost sort of components to them in terms of shelter. So we took sort of trends on where we have come from and used that as the basis to project out where we think we're going to go over the conclusion of this fiscal year and through next year. And so we came up with sort of an estimate on where we think the growth in asylum seekers in shelter will go. And then we looked at the costs associated with sheltering these households. And so there's always a sort of constant flow of people coming into shelter and people exiting. And so we were looking at how many people at a point in time, we did this monthly, do we think will be in shelter? And then we looked at the cost of shelters. When we were doing this exercise last fall, when we sort of first started looking at asylum seekers as a separate entity from the general homeless shelter population, we were using the standard DHS shelter costs in our estimates. However, as the city has expanded its capacity, as we've done a lot of emergency procurement, those costs have escalated. And so rather than sort of use old numbers that were far lower than what the city is spending now, we got from OMB their April 2023 estimates on what they think the sort of daily cost of housing a family, housing an individual in shelter would be for asylum seekers. So we applied that cost to our sort of census estimate to come up with the shelter cost estimate. And then lastly, we wanted to look at the non-shelter costs. Again, this is about 20% of the overall price tag. But this is things like administration, legal services, the IT to set up intake centers and emergency management costs, health services. So those pieces, and that we looked at FMS spending, and again, escalated those costs, knowing that as you sort of ramp up likely things later in this fiscal year, as we have more asylum seekers in the city's care, things get more expensive. And then we also, again, ramped up these sort of overall administrative, legal, those types of costs in proportion to the growth we thought we would see in the shelter population. And this is how we got to our baseline estimate that 1.2 billion will be needed this year for asylum seekers and 1.9 billion for next year. So that's a total price tag of 3.1 billion over this 2-year period.
However, in recognition that there are many highly fluid variables in this situation, including among others, changes in US border enforcement, both the lifting of Title 42 and potential for other regulations, the movement of asylum seekers from border states to New York City, the level of service used by asylum seekers, and potential reimbursements from the federal government. Because we did this a month and a half ago, we did not, for example, include the $100 million from DC that came in. And so as a result of that, IBO also, in addition to the baseline estimate that Sarah talked about, created 2 additional cost scenarios, keeping our population projections the same, but adjusting the cost of shelter. And so we had a lower cost estimate that we reflected where the city would find new efficiencies, and that came to $2.7 billion over the 2 years, and a higher cost scenario, which was $3.7 billion, which notably is still under the $4.3 billion that the administration has put out. And yeah, and I think the final thing we just wanted to say is that we understand that this is a constantly changing situation and are continuing to monitor this and update our models accordingly. And like Sarah said, we're happy to answer questions either now or offline later if you want more details about this. And
I wonder if the new wrinkle in the scenario or cost estimates is the end of the 90-day rule, and if in moving people out of shelter, we can move people from hotels into shelter, and how we estimate that.
That's the next piece to consider in this puzzle. So every time we're sort of constantly monitoring this, and every time we do it, we try and reflect the best information we have at that point in time. So
what was your assumptions around the average length of stay and the difference between singles and families?
So we used the growth trends that we saw, particularly in recent months, as things have sort of escalated upwards, and applied that going forward. But we saw that for individuals, the length of stay, they tend to come in and out of the shelter system much more quickly than families. And we see that in the historical data, and we use that sort of looking forward.
What do you think the families, how long will they stay?
So we didn't exactly, the way that we calculated the population was we looked at kind of the average monthly populations in each of the different systems and the changes in that over time. So we didn't break out the kind of inflows minus outflows times, length of stay. Like we didn't break it down to that level, but what Sarah was talking about is kind of what you can see with the way that the kind of average population is changing from month to month.
An average population at any point in time and try to make an estimate. This is how many people are going to be in the shelter system.
In shelter.
At this
Yeah,
point in time.
and we did it monthly. Yeah.
Whether it's one family that has stayed over multiple months,
Correct.
or a family entered and exited, but a new family replaced them. From a cost perspective, there isn't a lot of difference.
I was just trying to.
No, it's a real exercise.
For sure.
What the difference between your assumption versus the cities, it's a big gap. So
The big difference that we saw was in our census projections. And so
Mhm.
that's really where it lies. And part of this is we in our model had some level of seasonality and inflow outflow sort of variance in timing. Things that happen on the southern border, changes there affect who's entering the border and seeking asylum. And then there's the question of who's coming to New York from the southern border. And so I think ours had a little more fluctuation in our census.
yours was lower. than the
Which
cities.
made ours lower, rather than sort of saying there's going to be continuous growth.
Straight line goes up.
Which is what they're assuming. I think it's going to keep going more and more.
Yes.
Well, and there's, I mean, the projections that IBO made is at a.
It does go up.
Strong increase,
Yes.
but with some fluctuation, whereas
Yes.
the projections that the mayoralty at that point were looking at were just the straight
increase.
Does the Fed do any estimates of what they assume? I mean, they probably don't, to be a corporate nightmare, but do they do anything that says like, hey, this is what we expect
They
over the border?
don't publicly.
Not that we can see.
And there's also this question of not only what is happening at the southern border, but then how does that translate to people arriving to New York? And even people arriving in New York, who's going to stay in New York?
Who's engaged in the services?
So you have a monthly average of
Yes.
what you believe happened in the past and what you believe is going to happen through the next fiscal year.
Well, we know what happened in the past.
Yes.
So we sort of,
Well, do we?
We're trusting the numbers we get from the administration, but yes, if those are accurate, then those are
But that's fair, you don't have much choice.
Yes.
But, and then projecting out, you're doing a monthly average. Could you share that? Did you put that out in your documentation, or are you putting that out? Here's the historical amount and here's where it's going.
we can think about putting that, sharing that. We discussed it in sort of broad terms, but we
Right.
can provide more detail.
I mean, we didn't release it publicly because that wasn't the point. Like, we really wanted to focus on the costs because they were focusing on the costs, but yeah.
But in the end, that average you're doing is really, it's driving the cost and it's driving the fight with the fight or the argument or the disagreement with the mayor's office on how they're doing it.
I'm assuming that they projected based off of what their essential, what we know about home.
Yeah.
Well, they also, I think it's important to remember that we had 3 cost scenarios, and so, with in effect, a low, medium, and high. And in fact, in the current fiscal year, our high scenario at that point was higher than what the administration is anticipated. So
Well, they're
it's-
saying they're going even higher.
Yeah.
Like all
the
public
difference
statements.
is, exactly, the differences were really in the next fiscal year. And I think it's also important to make a distinction between spaces rented for asylum seekers versus actual asylum seekers in those spaces. Which is also a nuance that becomes.
Say more of that?
That just because a room is rented doesn't mean there's an asylum seeking family or person living there.
Yeah.
We're working at looking at that. We don't.
Like
You're
that's back
saying
to
that
the
the
number.
city anticipated.
Let me call on Mary. Mary?
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to type, but it's too long. I have 2 questions. One is, this is the cost of the shelter or people who are in the shelters, right? So from what I understand, when they leave the shelter, if they stay in the city, they're still keep receiving some kind of support, and for 5 years or something like that. So is this cost part of your calculations? Or do they not get any support? Because I remember reading something like that, that they do receive some support for a while. And the second is, I was looking at your previous report, the share of the federal funds. Looks scary. The drop in the federal funds is looking very scary. So do you, in your calculations, is that is the federal funds excluded or included in that? So I'll assume that you're going to keep it at the same level, right? At the very low level.
So this is one of the distinctions and why we sort of did a cost estimate for asylum seekers, trying to break that out separate from more local shelter residents who are not in this asylum seeker category. There's this real difference between, so asylum seekers are not eligible for TANF, any sort of cash assistance under the cash assistance, whether it's TANF or safety net. Which is the state cash assistance program. And so if you're a local person and you enter shelter and you qualify for either TANF or safety net, those help fund your shelter stay. And before asylum seekers sort of was even part of this conversation, we were seeing as length of stay in shelters for families with minor children increased, people were timing out of TANF. They might have been receiving TANF benefits before they entered shelter. So the 5-year clock may have already started. But we were seeing a lot of families that the city was receiving less TANF money in terms of sort of on a per household stay. They were receiving less TANF money than we previously had been receiving. Part of this is changes at the state level on how New York City could use TANF money, but it was also this eligibility question. For asylum seekers, stays are city funded, and then with the state budget, the state provided 29% reimbursement for shelter stays. So this state reimbursement does not apply to administrative or legal costs or any health costs, anything else outside of shelter. And the 29% reimbursement rate matches what the state safety net, if a family qualified for safety net, what the state would contribute. So that's how that kind of funny number got pegged.
Could you, I know shelter costs are high. Could you summarize what were the other services that you put into your costs? Does that include public schools, after school programs, adult literacy classes?
So
because we're seeing upticks across the board in our programs.
I'm sure. We're hearing it from the libraries, from community service programs, from schools. So our education team, when we first looked at asylum seekers last fall, helped tease out how the funding would work for that. And schools get sort of per pupil funding. There's an adjustment. And then there's also funding for students in temporary housing, additional funding for English language learners. But that was sort of all built into who lands in schools, and the school system had a mechanism for funding that. Some of it is state, some of it is city. What we looked at was sort of things we directly could tie to the asylum seekers arriving in New York. So this was setting up intake centers, there's a lot of IT, either licenses for PeopleSoft to keep track of who's coming in, or setting up internet in shelters and making sure everyone had access to internet and cell phones to help coordinate, having people give out COVID tests and COVID vaccines,
Other
and
vaccines.
MMR vaccines to small children when they were arriving at the Port Authority. So those are the types of other costs that we looked at.
Has there been work been done, or you guys not doing work about how this may crowd out other than investments in other parts of the budget?
That's a big piece. That was a sort of the main motivation of why we wanted to look at this. In part of an exercise that we do at any budget is look at what OMB puts in its budget, and then we sort of assess it and see if we think that's realistic to either historical trends or what we're seeing spending at right now. And so this was sort of an extension of an exercise we're going to be doing anyway. But there was a lot of rhetoric that, I mean, to be clear, this is a lot of money. Regardless of how this shakes out, this is a lot of money and not something the city could have anticipated even maybe a year ago, certainly 2 years ago. And so there's this question of, is there room in the budget for this? Our economics team does a whole exercise on estimating revenues. If more revenues come in, then we have more money to spend on unanticipated expenses like this. So that's all these sort of puzzle pieces that we were working to figure out. Is there room in the budget to absorb this cost? Is there really a need to find savings elsewhere so that we can afford this?
So that's the common sense, right? So my other question is, when you talk to the city council, they actually have the exact kind of an opposite view of the administration, obviously, which is that essentially this cost is not a concern because there's tons of vacancy in private housing or in other places. We should be moving them to all the vacancies and then almost be cost control. That's kind of what I'm hearing. Like, and I feel like somebody's got to address that issue, right? Because that's a notion in the council.
Where are the vacancies?
So
they're saying, they're basically saying landlords, I mean, this is what I'm hearing, is that landlords are holding vacant units. And the city is aware of vacant units in their portfolio, and they're not doing a good enough job of filling those vacancies, right? So even in the housing portfolio, affordable housing. So some truth to this, we have a very onerous system for leasing up units. It's too onerous, and it's a slow roll. if we made it faster and got people into housing with a voucher, like we would be cutting these costs dramatically and it would have big effect. I mean, that's the argument that's been made in the city council.
So there's affordable housing and sort of the slow rollout on getting people eligible and actually between a building being ready for occupancy and actually moving people in. But there's been a lot of rhetoric around warehousing of rent stabilized units, in particular, with the rent stabilized owners group basically saying that because we can't get enough rent for these apartments, we can't repair them, we can't fix them up, and so we're leaving them empty rather than renting them out. And sort of tied to that, IBO looked at, we get the state rent stabilization data annually. And so we looked at vacancies, and what we're seeing is at a point in time, you have vacancies, but it's just natural churn. There were a sort of abnormally large number of vacancies in 2021. And we think this is largely as pandemic choices, people were leaving the city, happened, but those got rented up nearly, it's 60 to 70% of those are rented up by the next year. And we saw only a few thousand units were actually sitting vacant for multiple years looking back in time. So that's work in progress, but we're trying to also shed some light on the vacancy question.
So I want to be cognizant of time. We also have the education team, and I'm going to ask.
Yep.
Thank you, Sarah Jacobs. Ask you guys to split that. Oh, sorry, Henry.
Sorry, my question was about the state reimbursement that was announced, the 29%, whether that's prospectively or whether that includes any of the outstanding question of the numbers for the previous years. And the second question related to the issue of housing, whether that 29% also reimbursement also includes the cost of all shelters or only partial cost of shelters. That was one of the questions that came up out of the state budget. Thank you.
The 29% is for every dollar New York City spends on sheltering an asylum seeker, the state will reimburse us 29%, up to $1 billion in total. I believe it's retroactive back to last April. So tied to the state's fiscal year.
But there's a cap.
$1 billion, but you have to spend 4.3 billion in total to get to $1 billion from the state.
That $1 billion annually or just in total?
No, over 2 years.
Over 2 years, but only if, but again, it's only if we spend nearly 3 times that amount.
Yeah.
We only get the money reimbursed for what we spend. It's like, yep.
Okay, good, Henry. All right, Sarita.
Yes. Yeah, so I think we're going to start with addressing Wayne's question about, what are the costs of providing educational resources to students of asylum seeking families. So Julia, I'm going to introduce Julia. We published a brief about a month ago, looking at sort of the amounts that have been distributed to school budgets for schools that have received at least 6 or more students that are in temporary housing. So it's sort of a proxy of students of asylum seeking families, although the DOE does not actually track that specific number. So I'm going to pass it on to Julia to talk about her brief. Great.
So as Rita said, in May, we published a schools brief, and we were looking at the supports that are available to English language learners. Like Rita said, we knew that many of these asylum seeking families had students who would need language support and additional instruction. So we wanted to know the capacity of the city system, both now and prior to the asylum seeker families, to support those students. And we used school budget data. We found that there was an additional $26 million that was distributed in addition to the per pupil funds that Sarah mentioned through the Project Open Arms initiative. And we could use that budget data to actually identify an estimate for the number of new arrivals and the number of schools that they were attending. So we estimated that as of April 2023, there were roughly 13,000 students across 600 schools. We also produced a count of bilingual teachers and ESL teachers citywide as of October 2023, which was a count that wasn't publicly available prior to our report. We wanted to know if the schools that were hosting those new arrivals, those 600 schools, if they were better prepared to support English language learners than other city schools. And we actually found that they were. So we found that schools that had enrolled new arrivals were more likely to have at least one bilingual teacher than other city schools. But we also wanted to look at the broader landscape of what programs were available to English language learners as of last school year, which is the last year of data that we have. So we looked at the fall of 21 into the spring of 22. So that's before a lot of our asylum seeker students were arriving, but we wanted to get a context for the type of supports that were available. And we found that as of last school year, even before the increase in asylum seeker families, 17% of traditional public school students are identified as English language learners. And that's actually a slight increase from the year before. And we would expect that share to increase again when we have data for this current school year. And we know that English language learners enroll in one of 3 programs. 2 of those programs offer bilingual support, and one, the third, does not. It's called English as a New Language, or ENL programs. And bilingual instruction is often preferred for English language learners because it provides a lot of benefits: academic, social, and cognitive. We found that in that 21-22 school year, the vast majority of English language learners, 80%, are in those English as a New Language programs that do not have bilingual support. And that's actually a share that's been relatively steady over the last couple of years. We found students in Manhattan were more likely to be enrolled in bilingual programs than students in other boroughs. And we also looked at the home languages of our students who are English language learners and compared them to the languages in the bilingual programs we do have. And we found that the top 2 most common home languages match the top 2 most common languages in programs. So that's Spanish first, and then Chinese languages, which are grouped together for state reporting purposes. But the third did not. So the third most common home language of students is Arabic. 6% of our English language learners speak Arabic, and it's only 0.5% of our bilingual programs. The third most common language for programs is French. So we also wanted to, we're looking ahead to the future, and this spring, the Department of Education announced that they plan to expand the number of bilingual programs. So we're going to be very curious about where those are, what languages, and they're going to expand those across the city. Those programs have the potential to provide support for our English language learners, but they're also often seen as enrichment programs for existing students or English speakers, sometimes to retain students within the school system. So we're interested to see how that plays out. And we published our report in time for a city council education hearing. And we shared that report directly with 7 council members and their staff, and we knew that they would be interested in advance. And we heard back from them that it was useful before the hearing, and that is very timely. That's it. And if there are any questions.
You said that the schools that receive students are more likely to have at least one more English language learning instructor, but in general, were you able to see whether the ratios in terms of the students to the number of instructors were sufficient?
So we saw that on average, schools that were hosting asylum seeker students, or at least this proxy that we have, had around 2 bilingual teachers in the school, which is not a ratio. But we looked at also the share of the school's teachers and how many of them were bilingual. And it's about 6% for the schools that are hosting Project Open Arms receiving students. So it's not a very large ratio, and it's not a very large number of teachers either. That 1,000, we have 1,800 bilingual teachers across the city, of a teaching force much, much larger than that. So I think in terms of what the city is thinking about, and I've heard in hearings, they're talking a lot about recruiting bilingual teachers, having existing teachers get bilingual certification, because that's a whole other conversation that's very complicated. We've spoken to the U of T about this too. What are the barriers to become a bilingual teacher? Because it actually requires additional certification. So that's something that we're going to be following as well.
This was all based on FY 22 or school year 22 data.
So we could use for the English language learner data, we looked at 21-22, but for the budget data to look at where those asylum seeker students might be in the schools, we could track our through April 2023.
Okay.
So for that portion of the report, we have very up-to-date data. But when we think about the landscape of English language learner programs, we're a year behind in our data.
Because the data point that you shared that was interesting was about the language abilities of the
Yes.
bilingual teachers versus compared to the asylum seekers,
Yes.
because we've had, as of several months ago, we had 107 students move into 2 elementary schools in Chinatown. And both of those schools have bilingual teachers, but it's Mandarin and Cantonese. It's not Spanish. And I know those are challenges the principals are saying, but I raise this because that's anecdotal data. That's not citywide
Right,
data.
but I think that's a great point because that's the specific complication of a bilingual extension on your license. It's language specific, and
Right.
that matters for the whole intent of the program.
Yeah.
How do you decide where those kids go to the school, where the kids go?
There was an empty hotel and they put 270 families into the shelter, or sorry, 200 individuals who are families into that and turned into a shelter. And then the 2 closest elementary schools are a couple blocks each way.
And we know that the DOE has had coordinators within shelters of asylum seeker students too, to help with that enrollment process. And we were curious about that too. Were they doing a better job than the other schools in terms of, was there more support? And we were excited to see that actually the schools that those students are attending have more support. But I think sort of my overall takeaway is that there isn't enough support across the system. Just seems like those schools might have slightly more support, but maybe mismatched as well.
Right.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
Wait,
So,
sorry,
yeah.
You only looked at the bilingual comparison, so you didn't look at out-of-school time programs
No.
or any
No.
DYCD related programs? Okay.
Great. And then on the same topic of school budgets, we released a video series last week that was intended to really target parents and students and members of school leadership teams who might be able to read school budgets a little bit better. So I'm going to introduce Tina, who led that project.
Hi, so the 5 videos that we did, the first one was on the timeline, so looking at school budgeting timeline and at the same time, looking at the overall New York City budgeting timeline and looking at sort of key events in both and tying those together that would hopefully help any sort of advocacy, efforts that parents or students may have. And the next one was just how to find a school budget, because we had heard in a meeting with Senator Jackson's office that one parent didn't realize how to find their school budget online, asked their principal, we don't know what projects were there, but they weren't offering that information. So we figured that could be important. And I've seen like similar efforts like on the comptroller's office doing the same thing. And then on the third video, we actually looked at a school as an example of their Galaxy budget. So both how what funds were hitting that school budget, and also what the plan was for that. And it's difficult because every school budget is so unique, but we're in our outreach trying to advocate for parents to talk to their principals, but at least give them enough information that they know what to ask. Because and the fourth video is on school allocation memos, and the fifth video is on fair student funding. And I'll say like the cool thing I think about this is like a new product is what Sarita was mentioning, that was a really tailored outreach approach, and we made it with a specific audience in mind. And one of the things we also wanted to do was look at keep track of the numbers of who is actually watching this to see if this is an effective product. And to that end, Tara's been collecting the clicks and the views on our YouTube page. And we've seen an increase and we'll continue monitoring it. It just come out in another 2 weeks. But part of that tailored outreach approach was also emailing community education councils, which Tara collated and Sarah emailed. And to that end, yesterday, I presented to the Community Education Council 11 because they were happy that a deadline that we set very thoughtfully, that these videos came out just as the DOE is presenting on contracts for excellence funds and parents are looking at their school budgets. And so the other thing that we've done that is I think new for IBO is we put a survey on the page that has these videos, again, to try to get feedback from people who are watching the videos to include or exclude anything that is helpful in whenever we do another iteration.
So pretty innovative for IBO. And, you know, we're gonna, there is the video series, so we'll send it to you also. And it was really trying to think of a different way to reach an audience so that they could help understand their city, you know, how their city is functioning. But a very different strategy than, say, a lengthy printed report.
Very cool. I like this. And is there any effort potentially to maybe like go with different community boards or various public groups and say, hey, here's the video, we have to come in and talk with you about it or something like that?
Yeah, so as Tana mentioned, I did, we did email. So I emailed every community board, every community education council. As she mentioned, we did hear back from CEC 11, which is in the Bronx. But I do think that we do plan to continue outreach strategies and really think about the timeline that is in video one. And, based on when there are opportunities for parents to engage in the process to sort of do that outreach. Yeah.
And something else we envision with these is that I think of them as sort of hopefully like helpful on a modular level, and that if there's, for example, like we've discussed, like a PTA that's going to be discussing budgets on some level, that they could show some of these videos to just, and we try to make them as short as possible, but these are difficult topics to explain thoughtfully, but that they could show those videos and instruct the audience that they have. And so that was something I presented yesterday at CEC, is like, I hope that you use them. And I don't know if we have to include instructions, but you can stream them on Zoom, and that's popular. So, and there's even ways that they've introduced like a feature on Zoom where you can make sure that your streaming is optimized for viewing a video with audio. So hopefully like that can be part of, more outreach to audiences IBO currently doesn't have.
And also very different languages.
Yeah, through YouTube has a pretty amazing transcripting feature. And so we made sure to edit the transcript that its AI automatically generates. And then the translations that through, this is all closed captioning, the translation that's then that YouTube then creates is off our edited transcript. So hopefully it's more accurate and more understandable. And at least I checked it in Spanish, and at least having some of the acronyms and stuff capitalized just helps, with the understandability of those captions.
Also. Okay, mindful of time, do you want to speak a little bit about the upcoming classroom?
Yes. So we are at the request of an elected official doing an estimate of the cost of the class size bill that the state legislature and the governor signed. So it the clock begins this fall, so the 2023-2024 school year, and the bill stipulates class size caps based on grade level. So we looked at that. We basically used our most recent data, which was last school year, to estimate how many classes are in compliance and which class, and we also looked at like how much over compliance they are, meaning like are they one to three students, are they much larger than that? And so generally we found, similar to what the city has announced, that for the first 2 years, the city's schools will be in compliance. After 2 years, so that's hitting the 25-26 school year, there will need to be significant investments. We looked specifically at the teacher need, and we are estimating a pretty significant increase in the number of teachers needed in order to be in compliance. And I think in particular, middle and high schools, it's going to be much more challenging given the fact that students move around to different courses during the day. So just the sheer number of course and sections that there are in the middle and high school level are really going to impact middle and high schools in particular. But yeah, and in general, we found classes are, I would say like about half, especially in the elementary school level, have just a handful of students over compliance. And so I think a large, we point this out, that how schools grapple with the classrooms that are over compliance is really going to dictate the estimated teacher need.
We're also within that specialty, right? Because math, science teachers are next to impossible to find even now.
Correct, yeah.
So, thinking about specialties,
And the,
next to impossible.
the
Exactly.
size of the population, the size of additional teachers needed is,
It's, we're estimating more than 17,000. I would, I will say that we were really
I know.
conservative in our estimate. In terms of how, I think there's a large question about, like I mentioned, how are schools going to deal with over enrolled classes? If there's a biology class and a chemistry class, what's that new class going to be? And which students are going to be the ones that are over enrolled and, combined? And I think those are just really hard. They're hard questions that we don't have the ability to know how they're gonna deal with that.
The law does have hours.
Yes, there are a lot of exceptions. They can, for example, 1 year decrease the pupil to teacher ratio by pushing in a teacher, but they are supposed to come up with a plan to be in compliance. And so that's a temporary accepted solution. But ultimately, they do need to reduce the class size.
But Rita, is it the kind of thing that's like you can do the temporary and have the plan and keep doing the temporary until you, right? And
yeah, I think
this could drag on for a very long period of time.
it is possible. I mean, as long as as the law is written, school administrators along with collective bargaining heads have to agree on the plan. And so to the extent that, at some point, I do think they have to technically be in compliance. It depends on how that's enforced as well.
so we have been sharing this report frequently with the Department of Education and having copacetic conversations with no one falling out of their chair. And we do intend to make it public shortly.
Yes.
And we expect, it's our job is to take the legislation and analyze the impact. There are a whole lot of questions that other key stakeholders, policymakers, et cetera, will surely have about the intent of the legislation versus the actual implications of the legislation.
Right. And I will say we are, looking to address the new UFT contract and how that is going to impact our estimate. So we're looking into that. Awesome. So do you want me to remind folks that we have scheduled 2 upcoming IBO board meetings that I'm sure Jackie will disseminate information on, one on September 13th and the other on December 13th. I don't know if anyone has any other comments before we adjourn. Do I need a motion to adjourn?
Move.
Second.
Second.
Great. All in favor? We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.